I want to begin a journey into the southern Kalahari with a digression into language and into some rather striking facts that linguists tell us about language. The first is that according to the latest research they report, and I'm not an expert in these matters, I'm reporting other experts, but I trust them implicitly. According to these experts, human beings make about 160 different noises. If you add together all the sounds that human beings make in all the languages of the world, there are about 160 of them altogether. And English apparently uses around 45 to 50 different sounds. So I, tonight, will make about 45 to 50 different distinguishable sounds. If a Norwegian was sitting here, speaking instead of me, apparently he or she would make about 80 different sounds. Norwegian apparently has the most extensive sounding system of any of the Indo-European languages. It's the most, one of the most complicated. French apparently has fewer sounds than English, and Mandarin Chinese about the same. The Khoisan or Bushman languages of the Kalahari have about 125 to 130 sounds. And there are individual languages in southern Africa where almost every sound that human beings have ever made are used. These are the most sophisticated linguistic achievements in the history of language. And there's a whole family of these languages referred to as the Khoisan family. Many different dialects, in fact, even different families of language, all of which have this astonishing number of sounds. 500 years ago, before Europeans reached the Cape and began to colonize southern Africa, the whole of the region, the whole of southern Africa, was occupied by speakers of these languages. The whole of southern Africa was a web of linguistic acrobatics of the mouth, if you like. Of course, the Khoisan languages are famous for their clicks, their sounds, a whole set of consonants, a kind of sounding system that we don't have at all in any. In fact, there are no other languages in the world that have these sounding systems. They also nasalize their sounds and combine the nasalizations with the clicks. They do all kinds of things that are incredibly difficult for people like us to do. But 500 years ago, those were the languages that filled every part of southern Africa. And it was the speakers of those languages who were wiped out and destroyed by southern African colonialism from the late 1500s through to the end of the 19th century. When Europeans first arrived, when the Dutch first arrived at the Cape, they met a group of people called the Khoikhoi, who spoke a language called Khoikhoi Guap, which is a Khoisan language full of clicks. And they dismissed these people as chattering monkeys. The fact that they heard these strange sounds coming out of the mouths of these Khoikhoi people contributed to their firm conviction that they weren't really quite humans. They were some kind of strange animal making weird chattering noises, and helped in the justification of the complete dispossession, destruction, and even the murder of these peoples. The colonial frontiers that advanced across Africa from 1550 onwards included Bantu-speaking black farmers and cattle herders coming from the northeast, and then the Dutch, of course, coming from the south, and then the British following the Dutch, gradually pushing further and further into the southern tip of Africa, occupying every bit of land. And every bit of land they came to was previously occupied by hunter-gatherers, by Khoisan speakers, with their incredibly sophisticated languages, and also, of course, with their incredibly sophisticated way of being on the land and harvesting animals. These were the people who had developed the most amazingly sophisticated poisons for hunting. They made poison tips of their arrows by mixing insects with plants, creating chemical reactions that generated poisons that could then be put on arrows that attacked the nervous systems of animals. Very, very sophisticated hunting technology all across the region. Bit by bit, the colonial frontier moved north from the Cape, absorbing these people, driving them out, killing them off. By the early 19th century, there was one large group of Bushmen left in what became South Africa called the Kham people. And there's a lot of records of them, because when they were encountered, they fought somewhat effectively against the colonial frontier, shooting animals, resisting the occupation of their lands. And many of them were arrested, some were hung. There are terrible pictures from the 19th century of group hangings and Kham people for having killed cattle, and many were put in jails in the Cape. When they were in jail, there was a linguist called Dorothea Blake, an amazing linguist, who devoted about 30 years of her life to studying the Kham prisoners in the jails, and got their stories and put together from their stories a kind of extraordinary documentation of Kham belief and Kham language in South Africa. But by the end of the 19th century, the Kham were gone as well, and none of them, they were deemed to be extinct. And the view was, by the middle of the 20th century, by the 1950, that South Africa Bushmen had disappeared completely. And although there might be odd individuals, there was no longer a Khoisan speaking people left in South Africa. The 1960 census from the then apartheid regime, of course, didn't acknowledge the existence of any indigenous groups, and they weren't allowed a census category, but they were identified as zero, for what it's worth, in the official records. One doesn't need to believe the apartheid government statistics, of course. But more strikingly, in 1974, an academic called Tony Trail was given the job of deciding whether there were any Bushman speakers left in South Africa. And he went to the remotest part of South Africa, the very northern tip of the Cape, where Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa all sort of converge. The little neck of South Africa goes up at its northwesternmost point, the top of the Cape. And there he visited the descendants of Bushman families and interviewed everybody he could find, and concluded that the Bushman languages of South Africa were extinct. There were no speakers left. There certainly were no Bushman economies left, and there were no people who were the descendants even of the Bushmen of South Africa who were prepared to say that they were Bushmen, or who laid claim to a Khoisan or Bushman heritage. In 1995, early 1995, a South African lawyer called Roger Chennels, who had been an activist rights lawyer all through the apartheid period, a remarkable, courageous man, now living in the new free South Africa, made a trip to a tourist site about 3 hours north of Cape Town called Kakakama. Roger went to Kakakama out of curiosity because he'd heard there was an ethnographic exhibit there, a living ethnographic exhibit. And sure enough, he found a group of people who the tourist resort said were Bushmen whom you could visit. Here were living Bushmen on display as a tourist attraction. And moreover, you could go and talk to them. Now, Roger is an Afrikaans speaker, and he found that the Bushman man, who seemed to be the leader of this little group of people, there was 7 or 8 of them, men, women, and some children, with a grass hut, with bows and arrows, and making beads. The man whom he was introduced to was called David Kruiper, spoke Afrikaans. So Roger was able to talk to this man who was being marketed as a Bushman in Afrikaans. And so Roger said to David Kruiper, who was wearing his little loincloth, and the women were all wearing just their aprons and were bare-breasted, and the children were naked, and the little fire, like a picture out of a museum, Roger says. There they all were, and you had to pay to go and talk to them. And Roger went to David Kruiper and said, well, who on earth are you? I mean, where are you from? And David Kruiper said, well, we are Bushmen who were expelled from a park right on the Botswana border. We were kicked out of a park in the 1970s. We'd always lived in this park, said David Kruiper, but they wouldn't let us live there anymore. They declared the park a whites-only zone, so we had to leave. And Roger said, well, how many of you are there? I mean, who are you? I mean, and David said, well, it's our family. It's the Kruiper family. But if you want to learn more about it, go and talk to my father, called Rechlebstan, who still lives as close to the park gates as he possibly can. He said, if you drive, David Kruiper told Roger, if you drive up the dirt road to the park, you will find a grass hut very close to the entrance of the park. And that's where my father, Rekubstan, is living, because he stayed as close to the park gates as he could be, because he obviously wanted to be as close to his ancestral home as he could be. My father will tell you the story. So Roger went and talked to Rekubstan, drove up to the park about 800 miles north of Cape Town, and interviewed Rekubstan. And Rekubstan described how he and quite a few people, an extended family of Bushmen, had been living in the park, or the Kalahari Bushman Park, one of the most magnificent parks in southern Africa, famous for its lions and incredible red sand dunes, a very, very beautiful place. Rekubstan described how bit by bit the park authorities had forced them out. They had first restricted the areas they could move in, then limited the animals they could hunt for, saying they only hunt for certain species. Then they said they couldn't hunt at all, but they could only stay in the park if they did dances for people who visited the park as a kind of to encourage tourism. And finally they were told they just had to go, and they were chucked out. And they had squatted on what was a coloured township, a little area that was designated for coloureds, part of the repulsive apartheid system. And even in rural areas, they designated areas of land where coloured people could live. And Rekubstan's family, David Kraper, and their extended kin, about 12 to 15 of them, it was thought, had squatted on the edge of the coloured township, about 10 kilometres from the park gates, where they had been found by this farm owner who thought it would be a great idea to exhibit them as a special, amazing, living anthropological exhibit. Well, Roger, having gathered this story, went and spoke to David Kraper and other members of the family and said that under the new South African law, they could claim the park. When the ANC was in exile, before it came to power, they'd always said that when they did come to power, there would be a reckoning over land claims. And they introduced, in honouring this promise, they introduced a law early in their administration. Mandela's office introduced a law saying that any individual or group who had lost their property or lands as a result of institutionalized racist measures could claim the land back or compensation for the land, so long as it had happened since 1913. Now, using the 1913 cutoff eliminated what are normally called Aboriginal or tribal people's claims. But because the Krapers and Rekubstan's family had been evicted from the park in the 1970s, Roger saw that they could use this law to achieve a land claim that would in effect be an Aboriginal land claim, because it would be an Aboriginal group making the claim. So Roger proposed to the Kraper and Rekubstan group that he represent them and file a claim with the South African government under the new land claims legislation. That was in 1995. And the Krapers were very, very excited by this idea and thought it would be a very good thing to claim the park, South Africa's second most valuable tourist resort. And Roger, in collaboration with a regional organization, set up a tiny little group called the South African San Institute. San is one of the words often used for Bushmen. The San often refer to themselves. Bushmen often refer to themselves as San, at least several groups do. So they created an organization called the South African San Institute, and they raised a bit of money, and they hired someone called Nigel Crawhall, who was a remarkable sociolinguist, originally Canadian, but had lived many years in Africa, spoke many languages, including Afrikaans. And Nigel had the job of working with Roger and coordinating the research and all the sort of tactics and the land claim process, so that these 12 or 15 surviving Bushmen could claim the Gemsbok Park. At this point, two things happened, one of which is of relatively minor importance, and that is they contacted me and asked me if I would help them design the research, since I'd done this kind of work in Canada and And Nigel and I happened to meet, and Nigel asked me if I would help design a research process which would result in the documentation of the Krapa-Rekubstan claim. The other thing that happened is that a man called Petrus Falboy, who had been a bricklayer for most of his life on a building site on the South African-Botswana border, saw a television program about the Kakakama group and about the land claim. As soon as Roger, in fact, filed the claim, it became quite significant news in South Africa, and there was a television news item. Petrus Falboy, sitting in a small, very, very dismal community called Rietfontein on the South African-Namibian border, also not far from the park, saw the TV program and realized that he was a Bushman, Petrus Falboy, and he'd always been told he was a Bushman. He'd actually not been brought up as one in any very significant way. He only spoke Afrikaans. And so he decided, and he'd been injured on the building site and had been denied any compensation. He was a victim of the kind of the ruthlessness of the system. And so he decided he would devote the next phase of his life to working on the Bushman cause. And he traveled to find David Krapa and said, I want to work with you. And David Krapa introduced him to Roger and Nigel. And Petrus Falboy became the kind of political activist, and Roger was the lawyer, and Nigel was the researcher, and I was a sort of consultant, something or other. And the work began. Now, the first part of the work, I should have said one very important thing. I've left out one very important thing. That the Krapa family and Rekubstan spoke a language called Khoikhoi-Hwap, which is a Nama language, not a Bushman language. Now, the Nama are a sheep-herding people who came into the area several thousand years ago. They also speak a Khoisan language with clicks, very complicated sounding systems. And the Bushmen and the Nama had very close relations in the Western Cape especially. And many Bushman groups, it seems, who spent hundreds or if not thousands of years in association with the Nama, changed from speaking their indigenous language to speaking the Khoikhoi-Hwap Nama language. And so although Roger had found a group of surviving Bushmen in South Africa, he hadn't found a group who spoke a Bushman language. This was not of any significance to Roger, I might say, at all. He had no interest in language, really. I think maybe that's unfair on him, but not too unfair. So the work began. Now, the first part of the work consisted in finding the people. Our conviction from the very beginning was that there wouldn't just be 12 or 15 of them. There are going to be more. Now, these people were driven off the land. They were taken into various forms of slavery. They became the cheapest of labor at the backs of farms. They ended up living on the sides of roads as sort of beggars. When you drove to the park, up there's 40 kilometers of dirt road, the last stretch to the park, you'd notice little huts with people living in, and quite often outside a stand with people selling bows and arrows or ostrich eggs or beautiful little necklaces they'd made out of beads and shells. And we thought, well, many of these people surely must also be part of a diaspora, a kind of a fractured, scattered Bushman world or an original Bushman community. So the first part of the project was to go around the region searching for Bushmen. And we found 30 or 40 people very quickly. And one day, Nigel was talking to Petrus Falboy, and he said to Petrus, it's a real pity. The great pity is we're not finding anybody who speaks the original Bushman language. There must have been an original Bushman language here. It can't be that everybody only spoke Khoikhoi-Hwap or spoke these Nama languages. There will have been a regional version of the Khoisan Bushman languages. And Petrus Falboy said, oh, my mother speaks that language. And Nigel was astonished and said, what do you mean she speaks the language? He said, well, she speaks a language which she always refers to as the Otal in Afrikaans, the old language, or the Busmantal, the Bushman language in Afrikaans. And she says that she's the only person in the world who speaks it. So Nigel immediately went to visit Petrus's mother, called Elsie Falboy, who was about 95 at the time, and we're not quite sure about her age, was very old, extremely frail, and seemed very close to death. She lived in a lean-to against the shack, and spent most of her time lying down, said she couldn't walk, said she couldn't see, had no strength, and was sort of waiting to die. Nigel came to see her and said, she spoke Afrikaans, by the way, else it's a very important part of this story. So Nigel was able to say to an Afrikaans, is it true that you speak an old language? Is it true you speak a language you call the Bushman taal? And Elsie said, of course I do. Of course I do. I've always spoken it. And he said, well, speak some to me. So she spoke in her language to Nigel. Now, Nigel, being a very sophisticated linguist, immediately realized that she was using a sounding system that was different from Nama. She was not speaking Khoi Khoi Guap. And so he said to her, is this a Khoi Khoi Guap that you're speaking? She said, no. I speak that as well, she said. And it turned out she did indeed speak Afrikaans, Khoi Khoi Guap, and the Otaal. And Nigel, of course, didn't know quite what to make of this discovery. So he got in touch with the academic who had carried out the research in 1974, a man called Tony Trail. He was close to retirement by that point. He phoned up Tony Trail in Johannesburg and said to him, I think I found a speaker of the language that you declared extinct 25 years ago. And Tony Trail, 20 years ago. Tony Trail immediately got on a plane, flew to this Uppington in the southern Kalahari. Nigel met him, and they drove up to visit Elsie Falboy. Now, Tony Trail had used a tape of the language of the southern Kalahari in 1974 to test people's linguistic ability. Tony had found a recording of the language known as Omani, recorded in 1936, which was recorded right in the area of the southern Kalahari in the Northern Cape, which was, according to the tape, the language of the Omani people who were there. And he had used this for testing people's linguistic competence, to identify who all did or didn't speak the Bushman language of that area. So he brought his tape, his 1936 tape, he brought with him to Elsie Falboy. And he played the tape to her of Omani sign language. And Elsie Falboy translated it all to him. This was her language. This is the exact dialect of her language. She was a Omani speaker, and she was right, she thought, in saying that she was the only person in the world who spoke Omani, and she hadn't spoken it to anyone for a very long time. Tony Trail was completely astonished, did a series of checks on, he's a speaker of another Khoisan language, a world expert on Khoisan languages, did a series of linguistic checks and became completely convinced that indeed Elsie Falboy spoke Omani. Though she said the language wasn't called Omani, but she wasn't sure what it was called. Nigel then made, I suppose, the rather obvious imaginative leap, saying, I bet you that Elsie Falboy isn't the only speaker of this language around here. We now have to start a different kind of search. We have to search for speakers of this language, because they will be the holders of the most interesting part of the intellectual and cultural heritage of the region. So we began searching the townships, provided with clues, first by Elsie, who said she remembered there was a woman called Ainki Kasi, who she thought was living in one of the Uppington townships with her family, who had spoken. She remembered she spoke the language years and years and years ago. Now, remember, this is an area where nobody is literate. It's a 100% illiterate world, certainly amongst all the older people. There are no radio communications, no newspapers that people obviously are using. If they're not literate, they can't be reading papers. So when families were separated, they had no way of remaining in contact with each other. One of the disastrous consequences of the brutality of the apartheid regime for non-literate people, of course, was that when they were separated by the edicts of the crazy administration, they weren't able to stay in touch. It was incredibly difficult. So when Elsie Falboy said, well, I remember, 40 years ago, there was someone called Ainki Kasi who spoke the same language as me, that would have been the last time she had any, there would have been no later contact. But she did to lead us eventually to this person called Ainki Kasi, whom we found in a township outside Uppington called Rosedale, a rather grim place. And Ainki Kasi was living there with her husband, who very soon after died, a large extended family, and around the corner lived a cousin. Ainke Kassi and her cousin both spoke Romani. So we found two more. And then Ainke Kassi said that she had heard there were three sisters living in another township nearby, a place called Svartkop, the Black Hill. So we drove with Ainke Kassi to Svartkop. And there we found the most dismal conditions that I've ever seen. This is a place where, with poverty that is beyond poverty, there was nothing. It was a kind of a horrible outcropping of rock covered with dust and broken bottles and tin cans, in which hundreds and hundreds of people were living in dismal shacks where they provided the cheapest of cheap labor to the local grape industry. They had no water supply. They had to walk a long way to water. They were fenced in with a barbed wire fence. They were squatting on the land owned by grape farmers. And in return for being allowed to squat there, then they were able to provide this labor. At the worst end of this terrible place was a little cluster of shacks where we were led to. We kept asking, well, where are these sisters? We hear there are three sisters who are Bushmen. And eventually we were led to this cluster of dismal little shacks. And there were these four women, not three, three sisters and their cousin, called Tuna, Kais, and Kabakas, the three women, and the cousin called Chrit. And the three sisters all spoke the language fluently. And they all spoke it to each other, moreover. And we arrived with Ainke Kassi, and we had with us a tape recording of Elsie Falboy speaking the language. So we played. And the excitement was extraordinary. These three sisters went crazy. They went crazy, shouting, screaming, jumping up and down, singing. They had thought that no one would ever take any notice of their language, them, their heritage, ever again. Similarly, I should say that once we had started working with Elsie Falboy on this project, she sort of like rose from the dead, Lazarus-like, and suddenly sort of sat up, expressed a great deal of interest in having vitamin tablets, you know, and decided to live quite a lot longer. And similar to Svartkop sisters, as soon as we encountered them, they exploded into life. And they gathered, everybody around them, all these dozens of people all gathered around them, and they said, you see, we've always told you that our language is important. We've always told you it's important. You've never taken any notice, but it's important. Because these white people have come and they say it's important. And we played a tape to the Svartkop sisters of Elsie Falboy speaking the Romani language, so-called Romani language. And they were incredibly excited, and they immediately recorded a response on another tape for us to take back to Elsie, saying, if it's really true you speak the language, then we better all meet together and we better all work together. Then we took this tape back to Elsie Falboy and told her that now there were 5, actually 6, including Ainke's husband, though unfortunately he died early in this research. There were now 5 or 6 people who spoke this language. And Elsie Falboy at this point recorded a message to Nelson Mandela in her language. That's what she said she wanted to do. And she said in her language, which she translated for us, she said, Nelson Mandela, it is time for the Bushmen to rise up and drive out the farmers and take back our land. And Elsie Falboy, aged 95, somewhere between 95 and 100, became a leading militant in the Northern Cape. Well, in the course of our research, we discovered another remarkable little fact, and that is that in 1935, the British government, very, very anxious about what was happening in South Africa, fearing that South Africa was about to leave the Commonwealth because of the race issues and political divides, the British government encouraged the South African administration to set up a thing called the Imperial Exhibition, the 1936 Empire Exhibition, which sort of celebrate empire. And somebody called Mr. Bain had the idea that if there was going to be an empire exhibition, there ought to be a Bushman exhibit at it. This is in 1935. And Bain knew that in the southern Kalahari there were some Bushman families still living in the Gemsbok Park. before they had been driven out. And so Bain applied to the South African government for a permit to have this Bushman display as part of the Empire exhibit. And the South African government, true to its character, said, well, this might be to prove that they were racially pure. And to prove they were racially pure, he would have to satisfy certain criteria. He would have to convince that physically they were pure Bushmen, genetically they were pure Bushmen, and that they linguistically were Bushmen. Now Bain, not daunted by this difficulty, got in touch with several key academics in the field, specialists on racial purity and brain physical structures, and brought them to the Southern Kalahari, where he created a camp for about 75 to 100 people that he herded in from the inside and around the park, and had them all examined. And these experts examined them. And they measured the length of their heads against the width of their heads and their nostrils and noses. They measured their heights and their shoulders and muscles. They examined all their genitals. There was a widespread view in the 19th century that Bushmen have distinctive genitalia, especially the women, distinctive labia. So he had all the women's labia examined and recorded. And they created this huge report on the surviving Bushmen of the region. We didn't know about this at all when we began the work. We found out about this quite late on in the project. And Bain concluded, or his experts concluded, these people were indeed pure, or there were enough of them who were pure, who qualified as racially pure Bushmen. So the exhibit went ahead, and 50 or 60 people were taken in a truck to Johannesburg, where throughout the life of the Empire exhibition they danced and displayed and made bows and arrows and generally showed off the Bushman things to the excited visitors. And apparently they were one of the big successes of the Empire exhibition of 1936. We found out about this because of someone searching an archive. Nigel found the report that had been produced by the experts. And in the report there were photographs of the people, they're like mugshots, head-on profile, the racial purity establishing type photographs, as well as some few sort of family scenes. So Nigel got copies of these photographs. And one day when visiting the Swartkop sisters, the three sisters and their families, Nigel was telling them about, he found these photographs in this report, and they said, oh, let us see the photographs. And Nigel said, oh, here you are, look at these photographs. And he spread out the photographs for them to look at and said, can you identify any of the people here? Thought it would be a good way of finding other members of the community. And they looked and looked, and after a while they said, well, that's us. They said. And sure enough, there the three sisters were as young girls, and they had been taken, it turned out, to the Empire exhibition. They had been part of the exhibit. They'd never told us. We found it out through this rather indirect route. They went in 1936 to the Empire exhibition in Johannesburg as pure Bushmen to sing and dance. And they then told us the story of the whole Empire exhibition and how that they went from Johannesburg to Cape Town, where there was a continuation of the exhibit, and then they were taken from Cape Town and dropped back in Uppington, which is about 120 miles from the gate to the park, and sort of left to make their own way home. So with some difficulty they made their way back and got back into the park and went back to the particular area of the park where they had been living when they were picked up by this guy Bain in his truck. And they found that all their huts had been destroyed and burned, their things had been taken, and they in effect were told that they could now leave the park. The park authorities used the opportunity, it seems, of them going to Johannesburg to evict them. So in this way we discovered what seems to have been the first clear eviction from the park. The park was only set up in 1931, but in 1936 they're already evicting people. So the Swartkop sisters gave us a crucial piece of the history. And they also told us that their father had been very severely beaten when he protested against this dispossession, but protests got them nowhere, and they had never been back in the park since. 1937, I suppose it would have been when they made their way home, 37 or 38. Meanwhile, the search for speakers of the Romani language continued, and the preparation of the land claim went on. By 1997-98, we had about 12 speakers of the language. We discovered that the language was called Ngu, that's its proper name, Ngu. And we had found a Namibian linguist who I managed to persuade to convert his PhD thesis from what he had supposed it was going to be into a study of Ngu orthography and linguistics. He was called Levi Namaseb. He was a Khoikhoi speaker from Namibia, so he already spoke a click language which had many tones, so he could handle the sounding system. And he spent a lot of time working with Ngu-speaking elders until he was able to speak it himself, and he created a writing system, an orthography for Ngu, and tried to collect from these surviving 12 speakers their stories and especially their myths in Ngu language itself, which was a source of tremendous excitement to everybody. And very significantly, not only was it a source of excitement to the Ngu speakers themselves, it thrilled those who didn't speak the language at all, and those who probably never even heard the language. The idea that their original language has got a life after all somehow not only represented the fact that they themselves had a life after all, but something deeply embedded in the land had a life, and their whole way of knowing the world had a life, and the whole cosmology had a life. So the existence is endowed, and existence lives in language, of course. And people, I think, felt the reality and the truth of that and expressed it in their excitement. One of the most thrilling moments in the course of the work was the first time that we were able to read to people the stories that we'd recorded in Ngu. Levi read them in Ngu at a meeting, included no speakers of Ngu. He read the stories in Ngu and translated them into Afrikaans. So people heard this language that was their language, and they realized it was now written down, and that it could be translated into Afrikaans. It was a moment of extraordinary jubilation on the part of the community. Meanwhile, the community itself is getting larger and larger, up to about 300 by the end of 1997-98, and we were signed to prepare the land claim. We put together the stories that all these people had told us about where they'd been. We'd made maps of the areas they'd hunted and gathered. We'd made a map that represented their life histories to show how they'd been displaced and where they'd gone when displaced. We'd created an account of how people had survived by using their indigenous knowledge, then especially their astonishing knowledge of plants, to endure extreme hardship. Most people, it turned out, had kept themselves alive by working as migrant farm workers, cheap farm labor, would stay on a farm for a while, really as slaves, I think, better called slaves, farm slaves. They'd stay on a farm for a while as slaves in the back, and then sometimes a year, sometimes 3 or 4 years, then they would be kicked out, or they decide to move on, or conditions would become just too brutal and they would go, and then they go to another farm. And they kept themselves alive on these farms, which were always close to the edge of the desert. They always tried to work on farms near to where their original homes had been. They kept themselves alive on these farms by using indigenous knowledge, especially of plants, also hunting of small animals, which they often did covertly. And also they kept themselves healthy, using, as best they could, using indigenous plants for medicines of all kinds. So the huge knowledge that the Bushmen carry about the land, the desert, the plants, and the animals was maintained in this very grim rural proletarian diaspora. And this was the story we were getting. But it seemed to us that it would take a lot of work and a lot of time to get from this body of information to actually filing a claim that could be successful in the land claims court under the legislation. We had a timetable, which we thought would be sort of a 2 to 3 year period to go from where we were for getting the claim registered. The claim had to be examined and verified, and then there have to be hearings. And we knew from other cases this is a slow and complicated and difficult process. Meanwhile, we also knew that the claims courts that Mandela's government had set up were to some extent collapsing under the weight of the number of claims. I think at one point there were 3 million separable individuals who were filing claims, often as groups. And in a way, you could say almost every black and coloured person in South Africa could claim under this law. They'd to some extent been dispossessed, were relocated, had lands, houses, livelihoods taken from them by institutionalized racism. So the idealism of this law was, of course, its own Achilles heel. It was its own vulnerability. So we realized that we thought this would be a very slow and difficult process. However, something rather surprising came to our aid, and that was, once again, Elsie Falboy. Now, Elsie Falboy, not only had she risen from the dying and become a sort of leading militant, she also enjoyed the media. I think, having been kept suppressed and silent for 90-some years, she was going to have her say whenever she could have it. And she was angry, articulate, passionate, and very old. Very, very amazing combination. And the media, of course, came to her in quite significant numbers, because the idea that there was one surviving speaker of this dead language was very, very attractive to the media. And they always chose to ignore the fact that we were finding more and more of them. And the media never, ever acknowledged that Elsie was anything other than the only speaker of her language in the world. That's how they kept their story. But the BBC came, Australian Broadcasting Corporation came. These are the ones, to my knowledge. 2 American broadcasters came that I know of. Various other European stations. German radio and print media were there, knocking at Elsie's door, though she didn't have a door, but knocking on the drapes outside her lean-to, interviewing her. And Elsie began to charge ever higher prices for her interviews. In fact, and I did a series of, in the course of our research, because Elsie's story was very important, I did a series of filmed interviews with her. And the last but one I did before she died. She died about 18 months ago. The last but one I did, she kept stopping the interview saying, "I won't go on until you give me another 100 rand." And on those terribly embarrassing chunk of film, there's Elsie talking, every so often stops. She says, "Give me money." My hand reaches forward into the shot. And she takes another note out of my hand and then continues on. So Elsie became a great figure and discovered that there was an economy here. And now, as a result of Elsie's media friendliness, of course, the story about the Southern Kalahari claim was all over the newspapers. And someone in Mandela's office must have started noticing all these stories. And one day, I remember Nigel and I were sitting in a cafe in Cape Town at the end of one of our periods of working in the Southern Kalahari, in a little Greek cafe at the edge of Cape Town, and Nigel's cell phone rang, and he picked it up, rather irritated that we were being interrupted, and it was someone from Mandela's office calling us, saying, well, could they talk to us about this claim? And it turned out that either Mandela or someone close to him had suddenly seen the symbolic advantage to the administration of this claim. Here were the original victims of racism in Southern Africa. The Bushmen were the first people to be oppressed because of race in Southern Africa. So surely, someone in Mandela's office said, one of the first claims to go through should be theirs. They should symbolize their commitment to justice by addressing the injustices suffered by the original victims of racism. So we were suddenly pulled out of the edges of nowhere and from the bottom of this heap of claims and told that they wanted to fast-track this claim and get it through while Mandela was still in power. So our little fringe activity on behalf of the Omani Ngu-speaking Bushmen suddenly became a high-profile, I suppose, in its own little way, a high-profile land claim. entirely supported by government. Very strange experience for me to be working on a land claim that was supported by government rather than being pitted against government. And sure enough, after not a great deal of negotiation, in March 1999, towards the end of Mandela's administration, a deal was agreed with the Khomeini. And they were given more or less what Roger, who was still negotiating for them, asked for. He said they wanted around 40,000 hectares of land that was not in the park in compensation for yielding rights in the park. And they were given 25,000 hectares of land in the park, which remained to be selected, and rights to the rest of the park, which remained to be negotiated. They received a pretty huge deal. Meanwhile, we were setting up a new language program and what we called a cultural resources audit, a mapping and recording of all the intellectual and cultural heritage of the people, not only new speakers, but all the people who identified themselves as part of the original Southern Kalahari Bushman community. We're now up to about 23 speakers of Ngu, and the community is around 1,000. They're still growing, still more people appearing. We're still finding more speakers of Ngu. But this was, by March 1999, the first indigenous people's land claim to go through in Southern Africa. I could end there, but in the interests of truth and honesty, I won't. Once the claim went through, our problems began. That there was no way this community was ready for a land claim on this scale. The established leadership was not prepared for the incredible stress and burden of having to handle this kind of a deal. And many people immediately wanted to relocate to the new settlement sites. The three sisters from Swartkop insisted on renting a truck, loading all their possessions in and driving up into the desert and creating a whole new kind of squatters camp in the middle of the new land. People up there, the Kraper family, were very resentful of this. They thought the claim should all be theirs, or some more significant parts of it should be. And bit by bit, the kind of excitement and integration of the land claims process that we had been working with and working towards from 1994, I suppose, when Roger first began, to 99, began to break apart. And very severe stresses and difficulties began to engulf the community. And the dealing with those stresses is what everybody is now working on, and we have a 5-year program which we're into 1 year of. We have 4 more years of work on the implementing of this claim. But meanwhile, there are people who rightly call themselves Bushmen in South Africa, and there is a significant group of people who speak this language called Ngu.